February 12, 1945. 4:47 p.m. The hills near Epernay, France, lay silent beneath a sky the color of gunmetal. In the brittle chill of late winter, a young American infantryman pressed himself flat against the frozen soil. His name was Jack Bigum, 22 years old, a sniper with the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, part of the famed 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army. The air was heavy with the scent of cordite, damp pine, and fear. Cradled in Jack's gloved hands was a Springfield M1903A4, the Army's standard sniper rifle, except his wasn't standard at all. Its scope was a handmade invention, a Frankenstein's creation of steel and glass, built from the wreckage of war. A broken medical microscope for optics, a steel ring scavenged from a German artillery fuse, and dials marked not with machine precision but with pencil scratches. His comrades had laughed when they saw it. They called it a toy, a death wish, a madman's experiment. Gonna diagnose the Krauts or shoot 'em, Bigum? Someone joked. But 27 seconds later, laughter died. Across the valley, a German Panzer IV, over 1,200 yards away, erupted into fire and steel. The shockwave rolled through the trees like thunder. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't an airstrike. It was one man, one rifle, one impossible shot. And just like that, the toy became legend. This is the true story of Jack "Red" Bigum, the American soldier they mocked, until he used his homemade scope to rewrite the rules of the battlefield. A story of doubt, invention, and the shot that defied belief. Blueprints in the dirt. Winter, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge tore through the Ardennes. The men of the 4th Infantry Division were battered, frostbitten, and grinding eastward through mud and death. By early February, they had reached the Champagne-Ardenne region, pushing through the dense forests near Epernay. Their orders: probe German defenses beyond Bois d'Ain Ridge. Among them was Private Jack Bigum, a quiet mechanic from Marshall, Kansas, a farming town barely big enough to find on a map. Before the war, Jack's battles had been fought with wrenches and gears, not rifles. He had apprenticed under his uncle in a watch repair shop, where steady hands and patience were survival tools. Old customers used to say, "Kid's got nerves made of ice." When drafted in 1943, those same nerves made him stand out at Fort Benning. He wasn't just a good shot. He understood the mechanics behind the shot. He could read wind like language, estimate range by shadows, and adjust elevation by instinct. But without enough sniper scopes in circulation, and with command focused on mass manpower, Jack was sent to the line as a regular rifleman. By January 1945, after the Ardennes campaign, the Army faced a harsh reality. Its snipers were under-equipped and undersupplied. Many scopes had shattered, fogged, or vanished in chaos. In Bigum's battalion, only 3 scopes remained. Jack saw a problem. Then he saw a solution. At a field hospital near Epernay, he scavenged a damaged microscope, a Bosch and Lohm model cracked in transit. From it, he extracted the lens tube. From a wrecked German 88mm shell, he forged a mounting ring. For 2 sleepless nights, under a dim lantern and freezing wind, he soldered, filed, and aligned his invention to fit his Springfield's barrel. When he presented it to his squad, the laughter was instant. "That thing looks like it belongs at a science fair." "It ain't regulation," said the sergeant. "Don't come crying when it explodes in your face." But Jack just smiled, tightened the bolts, and said nothing. He spent hours testing it in the woods, adjusting for drift, temperature, and glare. The scope wasn't perfect, the glass tinted blue, the focus drifted with the cold, But it worked. It magnified. It aimed true. And it was the only scope he had. Jack wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing precision. In an army where innovation usually flowed from headquarters, Jack proved the opposite. Sometimes the most important advancements are born not in laboratories, but in mud and desperation, in the hands of a soldier who refuses to accept standard issue. 1,200 yards of doubt. Jack never asked permission to build it. He knew the answer would be no. Instead, he asked for time. Time to think. Time to build. Time to perfect. At night, hidden beneath a canvas shelter west of Epernay, he worked by the red-tinted beam of a medic's flashlight. He wrapped tools in burlap to muffle sound. He kept a small notebook, pages filled with calculations for wind, temperature, and distance. He dismantled the microscope tube into its parts. Objective lens, focus ring, ocular. He mounted them with handmade brackets, clamped by scavenged bolts. For crosshairs, he stretched a single strand of telephone wire, painted black and sealed in dental cement. Crude, but deadly precise. Every night after dusk, he would walk to a clearing known as Red Hill, named not for blood, but for the color of the clay, and test his creation under starlight. What he didn't know was that, within days, the thing everyone called a toy would make him a legend whispered in mess tents for decades to come. Red Hill, France, February 11th, 1945. The soil there was iron-rich, red as rust. That's where Jack practiced. He lined up old, dented helmets on fence posts, 200 yards, then 4, then 6. Each night, he moved a little farther back, testing the reach of his homemade scope under a pale moon that cut through the fog. He kept notes, measured the fall of each bullet, marked the way his lens behaved in the cold. When frost began to cloud the glass, he solved it the way only a mechanic would, by wiping the inside with a thin layer of soap and polishing it to clarity. Crude, but it worked. Jack rarely spoke during these drills. The others knew where he went. Some laughed, some shook their heads. A few watched from afar as the quiet Kansan inched deeper into the dark. Once, his platoon sergeant barked, "You're wasting ammo we don't have." Jack didn't argue. He just said, "Sir, I'll bring them back clean." By February 10th, intelligence reports confirmed what the men feared. German armor was on the move near the Bois de Lin, their steel beasts grinding westward through the mud. Among them, Panzerkampfwagen IVs, the Panzer IVs that had terrorized Europe since '39. The variant spotted was the Ausführung H, armed with 75mm high-velocity guns and armored with nearly 80mm of steel. To any infantryman caught in the open, it meant instant death. The usual answers, airstrikes, anti-tank guns, bazookas, weren't available here. But Jack wasn't planning to punch through armor. He had studied the Panzer's blueprints, knew every weld and weak point. He understood the soft targets. The engine deck, the fuel intakes, the spare canisters carelessly strapped to the rear hull. If he couldn't pierce the tank, he could make it burn. He didn't dream of glory. He dreamed of chaos, smoke, confusion, the enemy forced to abandon their machines. The setup. By February 11th, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment advanced into the outskirts of Bois de Lin, a cold, tangled forest overlooking a shallow valley near the Marne River. Orders from command were simple. Push through, weaken the German line, seize the ridge before the spring offensive. But scouts brought back something unsettling. Armor traffic, steady, patterned, hidden. 3 Panzer IVs entrenched along the western edge, rotating in shifts every 6 hours. The Germans weren't retreating. They were digging in. That morning, at the command briefing, Lieutenant Colonel Harris looked around the tent and said, "I need a sharpshooter on overwatch by dawn. Someone calm, precise, knows the ground." Only one name came up: Bigum. When Jack stepped inside the dim command tent, Harris eyed him like a man appraising a tool he didn't ask for. "I hear you've been playing scientist," the colonel said flatly. "Yes, sir." "You think that contraption of yours can hit anything past 400 yards? "I know it can, sir." No smile, no nod, just a map pushed across the table, a red circle at grid 17 Alpha, an elevated ridge roughly 1,200 yards from the German line. "You'll move before dawn," Harris said. "No backup, no second chances." "Yes, sir." The longest night. That night Jack packed light. His Springfield with the homemade scope, 40 rounds of hand-selected match ammo, wire cutters, 2 canteens, 1 chocolate bar. No sidearm, no illusions. He moved out alone as the last light died over the horizon, crossing a frostbitten field that glowed silver under the moon. By midnight, he reached the ridge, an overgrown thicket of pines, and dug himself a shallow pit beneath a fallen trunk. The forest was deathly quiet. No wind, no insects, just the distant heartbeat of war, artillery thuds far to the east. Jack adjusted his scope, marked wind shifts by carving notches on a branch overhead, and measured distance by fence posts and shadows. He checked the bolts. Everything was solid. Then he waited, for 6 long hours, motionless, the earth freezing around him. At 4:47 a.m., movement on the horizon. A black column of smoke. A Panzer IV, crawling from the trees, its engine purring in the cold. It halted just beyond the ridge. Steam hissed from the exhaust. A crewman, bareheaded, likely the loader, climbed down with a jerry can and began refueling. Exactly the mistake Jack had been waiting for. A vulnerable tank. An exposed canister. One chance. He exhaled. 1,200 yards. A target the size of a lunchbox. Visibility, 3 seconds. He centered the crosshairs. His finger brushed the trigger. The world held its breath. And then, the shot that changed everything. The shot that changed everything. The front line was over a kilometer away. No one in their right mind would fire from that distance. But Jack wasn't aiming for the impossible. He was aiming for the unnoticed. Not the turret. Not the armor. Not the 80 millimeters of German steel that would turn any rifle round into a flat coin. He aimed for what he understood: vulnerability. He knew the refueling routines. Rushed, sloppy, hurried by fear. A loose cap, a few spilled ounces of fuel, a breath of wind at the wrong time, that was all it took. If fire reached the ammunition stowed behind the engine bay, the result wouldn't be a dent. It would be detonation. Through his scope, a single hand-painted wire crosshair glowed like a line of light. Wind, 3 miles per hour, west to east. Adjustment, 1/4 inch left at the muzzle, several feet at target. He inhaled once, steady, held it, squeezed. The rifle kicked gently into his shoulder. The report cracked through the valley, echoing off the pines. Then nothing. A frozen heartbeat. Silence. Then a spark. A hiss. A sudden bloom of orange. The jerry can ignited first. A flash of white-hot fuel that swallowed the crewman. One scream, then another. Fire crawled up the rear deck, slipped through the grate, and found what it was looking for. The ammunition cooked off. A thunderclap of steel and flame tore the Panzer open from the inside. The explosion clawed at the morning sky, scattering black smoke through the pines. Jack didn't move. He simply watched, eyes unblinking, the rifle still aligned. Across the line, German soldiers shouted in confusion, diving for cover, scanning the tree line for an enemy they couldn't see, and never would. On the American side, the men of the 23rd stared in stunned silence. They had heard one shot, then seen a fire, then watched a tank vanish into the sky. No one spoke until a corporal whispered, "No way, that wasn't Bigum, was it?" Another answered quietly, "He's the only one out there." When the mocking stopped, hours later, Jack crawled back through the frost and mud, his hands raw, face smeared with dirt, eyes hollow with exhaustion. When he reached the forward post, the laughter was gone. The jokes had died somewhere between disbelief and respect. They looked at his rifle, then at the scope, that ugly handmade thing they'd once called a toy. No medals, no speeches, just silence. And silence in a war like that was the highest kind of respect. The story spread faster than the smoke had. By nightfall, headquarters intercepted a German transmission, a sniper attack on armored units. The destroyed Panzer, serial unknown, had belonged to a mobile counterattack force meant to stall the 4th Division's push east. It never got the chance. Jack's single bullet had rippled through the front. German armor crews began changing procedures. Fuel canisters stored farther from the deck, refueling done only under cover, hatches sealed tight. It wasn't regulation that changed them. It was fear, the debrief. The next morning, Jack was summoned. He brought his rifle and the scope, still dusted with soot and frost, and laid them on the table. Officers leaned in, notebooks ready. For once, they listened. He explained the process. The cracked Bosch and low microscope, the salvaged steel ring from a German shell, the single-wire crosshair painted by hand. Trial and error. Range tests. Calculations. When he finished, Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward. "Could you teach this?" "Yes, sir," Jack said simply. Within a week, he was pulled from the line and reassigned to train marksmen from across the 4th Division. His lessons were quiet but unforgettable. Improvise with precision. Measure everything. Trust your instincts but prove them with data. One of the sergeants who'd once mocked him borrowed the scope out of curiosity. He peered through it, frowned, and handed it back. "It's ugly," he muttered, "but damn, it works." Legacy in steel and smoke. Word spread beyond their regiment. Other battalions sent runners asking for demonstrations. A major arrived demanding written documentation. A weapon built from scrap, solder, and stubbornness had done what no issued rifle had managed. Not by force, but by ingenuity. Jack never bragged. He never smiled about it. He simply cleaned the rifle, checked the bolts, and ran a finger along the cold steel like a man fine-tuning an engine. He knew what it meant. It wasn't about luck. It wasn't about heroism. It was about making something work when nothing else would. The war would drag on for 3 more months. By May 1945, Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent. The fields of Champagne and the Ardennes filled with rusting armor and ghosts of fire. Jack Bigum went home without ceremony. No parades, no grand stories. But the legend traveled faster than he ever could. Because in a war of mass-produced machines, one soldier had proved a timeless truth. The most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't what you're issued. It's what you build with your own hands. Orders and silence. When the war finally ended, there were no speeches, only orders. Orders to pack up. Orders to go home. orders to forget or at least try to what they had seen. Jack Bigum went back to Kansas in the summer of 1945. The town of Marshall welcomed him with quiet handshakes and awkward smiles. No parade, no brass band, just a community relieved to see one of its own return. His parents had kept his workshop exactly as he left it. A scarred wooden bench, half-finished watches, scattered tools, and a single notebook lying open. On the page, written in pencil and grease smudge, were the words, 3 seconds drift at 500 yards. He didn't speak much about the war. When neighbors asked, he'd offer a polite smile and say, I did my part. That was enough. The Springfield M1903A4 came home with him, along with the battered, handmade scope. Scratched, wired, held together by glue and willpower. It stayed locked away for years in a wooden cabinet, gathering dust like a relic from another life. The mechanic's legacy. In the 1950s, Jack was invited to speak at a local veterans gathering. He brought the rifle not to boast, but to remind. He told them about the cold, the doubt, the laughter of the men who didn't believe, about failure, patience, and the one morning where all of it came together. He ended with a sentence that would one day be etched on a brass plaque beside his display in the Kansas Regional War Museum. It was never about the scope. It was about believing I could make something better, even when no one else believed it with me. The Army never officially adopted his design, but his story took root where it mattered, in the whispered folklore of the rifle range. During Korea and later Vietnam, instructors sometimes told new recruits about the Kansas boy who built his own scope and took out a tank. The tale grew with each retelling, as war stories do, but the truth remained. One soldier's refusal to accept limits had shifted the conversation about what a single marksman could do. The historian. In the late 1970s, a military historian researching improvised weapons of World War II found Jack living quietly on the edge of town. They talked for hours. Jack opened an old padded case lined with flannel and lifted the rifle like a piece of memory. The scope was still there, scratched, soldered, simple. The historian took careful notes, then later published a chapter in a small, almost forgotten book titled Tools of Last Resort, Ingenuity in Combat. That same year, Jack donated both rifle and scope to the Kansas Military History Center. They sit there still behind glass, beneath a faded black and white photograph. A young man with steady eyes and grease-stained hands. Most visitors pass by without noticing, but some stop. They lean closer. They read the caption. They trace the scratches in the steel. And for a moment they understand. This wasn't the story of a decorated hero or a famous general. It was the story of a quiet mechanic who refused to accept the word impossible. Jack Bigum never sought legacy, but he left one anyway. How one bullet changed doctrine. Jack Bigum never thought of himself as a strategist. He didn't draw arrows on maps or plan offensives. He was a corporal, a field man, a trigger puller who simply saw tools differently. But history doesn't always bend to planners. Sometimes it tilts because a practitioner dared to think sideways. In the months after the Panzer incident, his name filtered through after-action reports and internal memoranda within the 4th Infantry Division. Nothing official, just notes in the margins, quiet acknowledgments. Analysts began to realize what his single bullet had revealed. That improvisation, when guided by precision, could be as decisive as any doctrine. That innovation didn't always come from research labs. Sometimes it came from mud, from necessity, from a single soldier's stubborn refusal to settle for standard issue. And though Jack Bigum's name never made the manuals, his idea did. folded into the DNA of battlefield adaptability that shaped the decades to follow. In the end, his story wasn't about a rifle or a shot. It was about the moment a lone soldier, lying in frozen French dirt, proved that ingenuity, even born in silence, even built from scraps, could change the course of a battle, and perhaps, in some small way, the course of history itself. The ripple, innovation, that was the quiet revolution Jack Bigum left behind. He had taken broken parts, a shattered microscope, steel from an artillery shell, scraps of wire, and turned them into something that worked under fire when nothing else could. That alone was a lesson in resourcefulness. But there was more. He had exposed a tactical blind spot. For years, sniper doctrine focused on men, officers, machine gun nests, forward observers. No one had considered that a sniper could influence armored warfare. Jack proved otherwise. After-action reviews began to change. Training manuals quietly evolved. A clause appeared in a post-war field manual. Personnel should be trained to identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized units when conditions permit. It never mentioned his name, but that sentence, that idea was his. A quiet revolution. Jack's success reignited a conversation that reached far beyond one battlefield. During the war, America's sniper programs lagged far behind those of the Soviets and the Germans. The Soviets ended the war with 20,000 trained snipers. The Germans, famed for their optics, made sharpshooting an art form. The US? Fragmented, under-equipped, inconsistent. But Jack's hand-built scope, crude, ugly, and functional, forced the question no one had asked. What if innovation didn't come from the top? What if it started in the mud, in the field, in the hands of soldiers themselves? By the 1950s, the Army began investing in standardized optics and structured sniper training. By Vietnam, snipers were no longer an afterthought. They were strategic assets. Rifles were sharper, optics clearer, doctrine smarter. Jack didn't build that system, but he proved it was worth building. He showed that battlefield intelligence wasn't just data, it was adaptation. The lesson lives on. Even today, soldiers are taught to identify vulnerabilities on enemy vehicles, to improvise, to think critically when supplies fail. Those lessons weren't born in a lab. They were born in the frozen mud of France, where a single man refused to believe that standard issue meant only option. One shot, one scope, one act of quiet defiance that echoed through generations of marksmen, engineers, and soldiers who learned that precision is not just about the tool. It's about the will behind it. Beyond doctrine, in every war, there are names carved into monuments, generals, battles, dates. But history is also shaped in silence. One decision, one invention, one act of defiance that no one sees coming. Jack Bigum never shouted his story. He never wrote a book, never claimed to be a hero. He didn't chase medals, and he didn't try to change the army. But he did. His moment didn't come in fanfare or chaos. It came in stillness, in control, in a belief that he could see what others couldn't, and hit what others thought impossible. The mindset. Most of us are told to follow the manual, to wait for approval, to do things the way they've always been done. But every breakthrough, in war, science, or life, starts with someone who decides, this isn't good enough. I can make it better. Jack's handmade scope wasn't just a technical marvel. It was a statement that ideas matter even when they look ridiculous, that perseverance is mocked right up until it succeeds, that the line between failure and brilliance is often just the courage to try anyway. Think about his battlefield: mud, steel, fear, a world where conformity kept you alive. And yet one man, with nothing but a cracked lens and a scavenged ring of steel, changed the course of a battle, not by following orders, but by thinking beyond them. The question: we live in a world of precision now, engineered, digital, factory-made. But the spirit that drove Jack Bigum is more vital than ever, because there are still problems that can't be solved with standard issue thinking. Still challenges waiting for someone to say, "I'll build it myself." Maybe that's you. Maybe you've been told your idea won't work, that it's strange, that it's a waste of time. Maybe that's exactly why you shouldn't stop. Jack's story reminds us, innovation isn't a department, it's a mindset. And sometimes the smallest act of persistence can ripple farther than anyone imagines. One man, one lens, one bullet, and a moment that still speaks to us 80 years later. What about you? What part of Jack's story hit you hardest? The laughter he endured, the silence after the shot, or the legacy no one expected him to leave? Maybe the real question is this: what would you build if you stopped waiting for permission? If the story moved you, share it. Because somewhere out there, someone is holding their own version of that homemade scope, wondering if it's enough. And maybe your belief in them is the shot they've been waiting for.